The dog had no reason to be there. And yet, before the day was over, he would become the only witness everyone believed. The courtroom in Billings, Montana, felt smaller than it should have that morning. The air carried the faint scent of old wood, coffee from the security desk downstairs, and the nervous silence that settles over a room before lives are changed forever. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows in narrow bands of gold, painting the polished floor with stripes of light. Every seat was occupied. Reporters lined the back wall. A few veterans sat quietly near the front, their hands folded, their faces unreadable. At the defense table sat Captain Nathan Walker, a former U.S. Marine. 37 years old, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven. His dark blonde hair had been trimmed short out of habit, though many habits from military life had already faded. The one thing that remained was the way he carried himself. Straight back, steady eyes, quiet dignity. But today, even that seemed heavier. For 8 months, newspapers had called him a killer. Television hosts had debated his guilt. Strangers who had never met him had already decided who he was. Nathan rarely responded. He simply sat through every accusation with the same silence he once carried through desert storms overseas. Beside him, defense attorney Rachel Monroe organized stacks of documents. She glanced toward her client, searching for some sign of hope. She found none. Nathan stared ahead at the judge's empty bench. The hearing was minutes away from beginning. If things went badly today, he could spend the rest of his life trying to prove something he already knew. The truth. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Evelyn Cross reviewed her notes with calm confidence. Her charcoal suit was immaculate, her posture flawless. To anyone watching, she looked like certainty itself, the kind of person who never doubted a single step she took. The spectators whispered among themselves. Some recognized Nathan from old news footage. Others had come because they loved a mystery. A decorated Marine accused of murder was the kind of story people followed. Outside, beyond the courthouse walls, a cold October wind swept across the city. Leaves scraped along the sidewalks. Flags snapped softly against their poles. Inside, everything felt frozen. Then it happened. A sudden commotion echoed from the hallway. Raised voices. Running footsteps. The heavy courtroom doors burst open. Every head turned. A German shepherd charged into the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. 2 security officers appeared behind him, out of breath and several steps too late. The dog moved with purpose. Not panic. Not confusion. Purpose. His sable coat shimmered beneath the overhead lights. His amber eyes searched the room once. Only once. Then he found who he came for. Nathan. The Marine's expression changed for the first time all morning. Atlas. The dog crossed the courtroom floor without hesitation. Past reporters. Past attorneys. Past the startled bailiff reaching unsuccessfully for his leash. Atlas stopped beside Nathan's chair. Then, with complete certainty, he sat down. Silence swallowed the room. The German shepherd pressed his shoulder gently against Nathan's leg and lifted his gaze toward the judge's bench. As if he belonged there. As if he knew something nobody else did. Nathan lowered a trembling hand onto the dog's neck. Atlas never looked away. And somewhere in that impossible moment, before a single word of testimony had been spoken, the entire course of the trial began to change. The judge entered moments later, and the room slowly returned to order, though the atmosphere had changed in a way nobody could explain. Judge William Hartman settled behind the bench and adjusted his glasses. His eyes briefly lingered on Atlas before moving to the case file in front of him. The German shepherd remained perfectly still beside Nathan, calm and alert, as if he understood the weight of the room around him. Rachel Monroe rose first. Her voice was steady, professional, but beneath it lived the exhaustion of someone who had spent months fighting an uphill battle. Across the aisle, Evelyn Cross stood with the confidence of a person who believed the outcome was already written. The proceedings began with familiar arguments. Dates, reports, timelines, witness statements. The language of the courtroom flowed like cold water over stone. Yet Nathan barely heard any of it. His hand rested lightly against Atlas's neck. The simple contact grounded him. For 8 long months, almost everyone had disappeared. Old friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even people who once thanked him for his service now looked away when his name appeared in the news. But Atlas had never left. The dog had stayed through every interview, every accusation, every sleepless night. As testimony continued, Nathan's thoughts drifted backward. 8 months earlier, life had looked very different. He had been working as a civilian security consultant near the freight terminals outside Billings. The work was quiet, predictable, exactly what he wanted after leaving the Marine Corps. Atlas accompanied him most days, enjoying long walks along the warehouses and service roads near the Yellowstone River. It was there that Nathan first met Detective Harold Pierce. Pierce was not what people expected from a detective. He spoke softly, smiled easily. He listened more than he talked. The two men became friends over countless cups of black coffee and conversations about service, family, and the strange difficulty of building a normal life after years spent wearing a uniform. Harold often joked that Atlas was smarter than both of them combined. The dog seemed to agree. Then everything changed. 3 days before the tragedy that would dominate headlines across Montana, Harold requested a private meeting. Nathan remembered the evening clearly. Autumn clouds hung low over the city. A cold wind rattled loose leaves across the parking lot outside a small diner. Harold arrived looking troubled. Not frightened. Troubled. He spoke carefully, choosing every word. He told Nathan he had stumbled onto information involving stolen cargo shipments moving through legitimate supply chains. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just numbers that did not add up and records that seemed designed to disappear. Harold never revealed names. He only said one sentence Nathan could not forget. If something happens to me, trust the dog. At the time, it sounded almost ridiculous. Harold had scratched Atlas behind the ears and laughed afterward, as if trying to lighten the mood. But the seriousness in his eyes remained. 3 days later, Harold Pierce was gone. Within a week, evidence began pointing toward Nathan. The accusations arrived quickly. Too quickly. Every answer seemed to create more questions. Every explanation somehow made him appear guiltier. Rachel had spent months trying to untangle the contradictions. Yet one detail never fit. Atlas. The dog had reacted strangely after Harold disappeared. Restless. Focused. As though searching for something only he could sense. Back in the courtroom, Rachel approached the witness stand while sunlight shifted across the floor. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears moved forward. Across the room, Evelyn Cross stood to present another piece of evidence. And for the first time that morning, a low sound rumbled quietly in Atlas's chest. The sound was barely audible, little more than a vibration beneath Atlas's steady breathing, but it changed the atmosphere instantly. Rachel Monroe noticed it first. She had spent enough time around the German Shepherd to understand the difference between anxiety and certainty. This was not nervousness. Atlas was reacting to something specific. Across the courtroom, Evelyn Cross continued speaking with calm precision. She moved through timelines and evidence with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every piece belonged. Yet Atlas never took his eyes off her. Nathan felt the dog's muscles tighten beneath his hand. The sensation pulled him back to another memory. It had happened 6 months earlier, only weeks after Harold Pierce disappeared. Nathan and Atlas had been walking near an abandoned freight yard on the eastern edge of Billings. The place sat quiet beneath gray skies, surrounded by chain-link fences and weathered loading docks. Most people ignored it. Atlas had not. Halfway through their walk, the dog suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. His nose tested the cold air. Then he pulled hard toward a row of storage buildings. Nathan remembered following him through puddles left by spring rain. Atlas led him to a rusted service door hidden behind stacks of unused shipping pallets. The dog sniffed the handle repeatedly before sitting beside it. At the time, Nathan found nothing unusual inside. The warehouse appeared empty. Dust covered the floor. Broken shelves leaned against the walls. Yet Atlas returned to that location again and again during the following weeks. Every visit ended the same way. The dog would search carefully, circle one specific corner of the building, and stare at the concrete floor as though waiting for something. Nathan never understood why. Back in the present, Rachel studied Atlas carefully while Evelyn introduced another document. A photograph appeared on a courtroom monitor. Several jurors leaned forward. Others took notes. Atlas did not even glance at the screen. Instead, the low rumble in his chest deepened slightly when Evelyn stepped closer to the display. Rachel felt a spark of curiosity. During months of preparation, she had reviewed thousands of pages of records. One detail had always bothered her. Nearly every major piece of evidence had passed through the same chain of custody. The paperwork was technically correct. Perfect, even. Too perfect. She glanced toward Nathan. He noticed the question in her eyes. Quietly, he leaned forward. Atlas only does that when something does not match what he remembers, he whispered. Rachel frowned. What do you mean? Nathan looked down at the dog. In Afghanistan, he could identify equipment after a single exposure. Different fuel, different chemicals, different people. He remembers scents longer than most people remember faces. Rachel's gaze shifted toward Evelyn. A thought began forming. Small, incomplete, but impossible to ignore. At that moment, Judge Hartman called for a short recess. Chairs scraped against the floor. Conversations immediately erupted throughout the room. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. Jurors disappeared through a side door. Evelyn gathered her files and stepped away from the prosecution table. The instant she moved, Atlas rose to his feet. His amber eyes followed her every step. Then something unexpected happened. As Evelyn passed near the courtroom exit, Atlas took 3 deliberate steps forward and stopped beside her chair. He lowered his nose toward the leather briefcase she had left behind. For a single second, he froze completely. Then he looked up at Nathan, and in his eyes was the same unmistakable expression he had worn outside that forgotten warehouse months ago. Rachel Monroe could not stop thinking about the look in Atlas's eyes. It was not excitement. It was recognition. The same quiet certainty that had guided the dog through years of training and countless situations where details mattered. When the recess ended, the courtroom slowly filled again. The murmur of conversation faded beneath the scrape of chairs and the distant hum of the building's heating system. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the Montana sky, dimming the sunlight that had earlier poured through the tall windows. Nathan returned to his seat. Atlas settled beside him once more, but the dog remained unusually alert. His ears tracked every movement. His gaze drifted repeatedly toward Evelyn Cross and the briefcase now resting beside her chair. Rachel opened her notebook and reviewed pages she had read dozens of times before. Dates, locations, interviews, shipping manifests, financial records. The details blurred together. Yet one memory suddenly surfaced. 3 months earlier, while reviewing evidence in a county records office, she had discovered a warehouse address mentioned in an old transportation report. The address appeared only once. It was never referenced again. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it felt important. Very important. Rachel quietly leaned toward Nathan. The warehouse Atlas kept returning to. Do you remember the address? Nathan nodded immediately. Pier 17 Storage Complex. East Freight District. Rachel's eyes widened slightly. That was the same location. The same forgotten address buried inside months of paperwork. Before she could say another word, testimony resumed. Evelyn Cross called another witness. The witness discussed schedules, deliveries, and timelines. Everything sounded convincing. Everything sounded complete. Yet Rachel noticed something strange. Whenever the warehouse district was mentioned, Evelyn redirected the conversation almost immediately. Not once did she allow the discussion to linger there. It was subtle, almost invisible, but now Rachel could not ignore it. Atlas seemed unable to ignore it either. The German shepherd lifted his head each time the location was referenced. His amber eyes remained fixed on the prosecution table. An hour later, the court paused again for lunch. Jurors exited through a side door. Reporters hurried outside to file updates. Nathan remained seated while deputies monitored the room. Rachel gathered her files but did not leave. Instead, she stared at a photograph attached to an old transportation report. A grainy image of a warehouse entrance. Rusted fencing, loading docks, faded numbers painted above a metal door. Suddenly, she remembered another detail. Harold Pierce had visited that exact location 2 days before he disappeared. The information had been buried in a cell phone location record that nobody seemed interested in discussing. Rachel's pulse quickened. She opened her laptop and searched through archived files. There it was. A timestamp. A visit. 12 minutes spent at Pier 17. Then another discovery appeared. Evelyn Cross had also been there. Not officially. Not as part of any investigation. But her vehicle registration appeared in a nearby parking log on the same evening. Rachel froze. Across the room, Atlas suddenly stood. Without making a sound, he walked toward the courtroom window and stared outside. Nathan followed his gaze. Parked across the street sat a dark blue sedan. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Yet Atlas watched it with intense focus. Then the dog slowly turned back toward Rachel. In that moment, she realized something chilling. Harold Pierce had not left them a clue hidden in words. He had left it with the one witness he trusted would never forget. That afternoon, while the courthouse settled into its slow rhythm of testimony and procedure, Rachel Monroe made a decision she had avoided for months. She stopped looking for proof that Nathan Walker was innocent and started looking for the reason someone wanted him blamed. The difference seemed small. It changed everything. The moment court adjourned for the day, Rachel drove across Billings beneath a sky heavy with approaching snow. The city lights reflected against low clouds, turning the horizon silver and pale. Atlas rode in the back seat beside Nathan. The German shepherd had not relaxed once since entering the courtroom. Every few minutes he would lift his head and stare through the window, as though following a trail nobody else could see. 40 minutes later, they reached the Eastern Freight District. Most businesses had already closed. Empty loading docks stretched beneath yellow security lights. Wind pushed scraps of paper across cracked pavement. The place felt forgotten. Pier 17 storage complex stood near the river, surrounded by chain-link fencing and abandoned equipment. Rachel parked near the entrance and stepped out into the cold. Her breath formed white clouds in the air. Nathan followed. Atlas jumped down last. The instant his paws touched the ground, his posture changed. His ears rose. His nose lifted. He began moving with quiet determination toward the same warehouse that had drawn his attention months earlier. "He remembers," Nathan said softly. Rachel nodded. "Then let us see what he remembers." Atlas led them across the lot. Past rusted trailers. Past stacks of unused containers. Past broken floodlights that swayed gently in the wind. The warehouse appeared exactly as Nathan remembered. Weathered metal walls. Faded paint. Locked service doors. Yet Atlas ignored the entrance. Instead, he circled the building and stopped near the rear corner where weeds pushed through concrete. There he began searching carefully. Not digging wildly. Not acting excited. Working. Methodically. Like a Marine on patrol. Minutes passed. Then Atlas froze. He lowered his nose to a narrow drainage opening beside the foundation. Nathan knelt beside him. At first he saw nothing. Then his flashlight beam revealed a small object wedged deep inside the opening. Rachel carefully reached forward. Her fingers closed around cold metal. She pulled it free. A flash drive. Dirty. Scratched. Hidden well enough that nobody would notice it by accident. For several seconds none of them spoke. Wind whispered through the empty freight yard. Somewhere in the distance a train horn echoed across the river. Rachel stared at the drive in her hand. This cannot be a coincidence. Nathan looked down at Atlas. The dog remained focused on the warehouse wall, as if his job was not finished. Rachel slipped the drive into her pocket. "Tomorrow morning, we will know what is on this." But Atlas suddenly moved again. He walked 20 feet farther along the building and stopped beside an old utility panel. There, almost invisible beneath layers of dust, sat a faded sticker. Rachel brushed it clean with her sleeve. Her heartbeat quickened. Printed across the bottom was the logo of a private logistics company. The same company mentioned repeatedly in Harold Pierce's investigation notes. The same company connected to shipments that never quite matched official records. Nathan stared at the symbol. A memory surfaced. Harold's voice. Quiet. Careful. Follow the shipments, and you will find the truth. The cold wind swept through the yard once more. Atlas finally sat down and looked up at them. For the first time in months, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The flash drive remained on Rachel Monroe's desk long after midnight. Outside her office window, snow had finally begun to fall over Billings. White flakes drifted beneath streetlights like silent prayers descending from the dark. The city slept. Rachel did not. Atlas lay beside the desk, his head resting on his paws, while Nathan sat across from her nursing a cup of cold coffee he had forgotten to drink. The small office smelled faintly of paper, printer ink, and exhaustion. Rachel inserted the drive into her laptop. For several seconds nothing happened. Then folders appeared on the screen. Hundreds of files. Shipping records. Financial transactions. Internal communications. Warehouse logs. The deeper she searched, the more her expression changed. What began as curiosity slowly became disbelief. Several shipments listed as agricultural equipment had never reached their reported destinations. Delivery confirmations existed, but supporting records vanished shortly afterward. Entire chains of documentation appeared to have been rewritten. Someone had spent years building a system designed to look legitimate. Nathan watched silently. Can you prove any of it? Rachel asked herself more than anyone else. She opened another folder. This one contained scanned notes. Harold Pierce's notes. His handwriting filled page after page. Observations. Dates. License plate numbers. Names connected through arrows and circles. Harold had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. Then Rachel found something that made her stop breathing for a moment. A photograph. Grainy. Taken from a distance. It showed the parking lot at Pier 17 on the evening Harold visited the warehouse. Several vehicles were visible. One belonged to the logistics company under investigation. Another belonged to Harold. And parked beside them sat a dark blue sedan. Nathan leaned forward immediately. The car. Rachel nodded. It was the same sedan Atlas had watched outside the courthouse earlier that day. The timestamp confirmed everything. The vehicle had been present on the night Harold gathered his evidence. Silence filled the room. Snow tapped gently against the glass. Atlas lifted his head. The dog stared at the photograph on the screen as though recognizing it. Rachel enlarged the image. A partial license plate became visible. Not enough for certainty, but enough to search. 20 minutes later, another record appeared. Vehicle registration. Ownership history. Government access permissions. Rachel's eyes widened. The sedan was linked through a chain of registrations to a private legal consulting firm. A firm that handled research contracts for several state offices. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Evelyn Cross. Not direct ownership. Not official control. But connections existed. Too many to dismiss. Nathan exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders seemed slightly lighter. Harold had not been chasing shadows. He had been documenting a real network. More importantly, he had hidden the proof before anyone could erase it. Rachel continued reviewing files until nearly 2 in the morning. Then she discovered the final piece. An audio recording. Short, barely 30 seconds long. She pressed play. Static crackled through the speakers. Then Harold's familiar voice emerged. Calm. Measured. Tired. If you are hearing this, it means I was right. The evidence is real. Trust the records. Trust Nathan. And trust Atlas. He notices what people ignore. The room fell silent once more. Nathan lowered his eyes. Atlas quietly stood, crossed the office, and rested his head against Nathan's knee. Outside, snow continued falling across Montana. Inside, for the first time since this nightmare began, the truth was no longer hiding. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow. The courthouse steps glistened white beneath the pale Montana sun as reporters gathered outside, their breath drifting into the cold air. Inside, the atmosphere felt different from the previous day. Something unseen had shifted. Rachel Monroe carried a slim folder beneath her arm as she entered the courtroom. She no longer looked exhausted. She looked prepared. Nathan Walker noticed it immediately. For months, he had watched people approach his case with uncertainty. Today, Rachel carried certainty of her own. Atlas walked beside them, calm and focused. The German shepherd's claws clicked softly against the polished floor as they approached the defense table. Across the room, Evelyn Cross appeared as composed as ever. Her charcoal suit was immaculate. Her expression controlled. Yet Nathan thought he detected something new behind her confidence. Vigilance. The courtroom gradually filled. Jurors took their seats. Reporters opened notebooks. Judge William Hartman entered and called the proceedings to order. The day's testimony began quietly. Rachel did not immediately reveal the evidence from the flash drive. Instead, she allowed the prosecution to continue building its case. She listened. She took notes. She waited. The strategy confused Nathan at first. Then he understood. Rachel was building a trap. Piece by piece, Evelyn Cross repeated earlier claims. Shipping records, timelines, documentation. Everything appeared orderly, complete, reliable. Rachel challenged almost nothing. The jurors watched carefully. Some glanced toward Nathan, others toward Evelyn. The tension grew steadily beneath the surface. Then Rachel stood. Your Honor, the defense would like to review several transportation records previously entered into evidence. Evelyn nodded confidently. No objection. Rachel approached the display screen. One by one, documents appeared before the court. Warehouse logs, delivery reports, vehicle registrations. Each seemed ordinary, until Rachel began placing them side by side. Small inconsistencies emerged. dates that did not align, locations that overlapped impossibly, signatures appearing in places where records showed individuals were elsewhere. The room grew quieter with each comparison. Evelyn's expression remained calm, but her posture stiffened slightly. Rachel continued. Then she introduced records recovered from Pier 17 storage complex. A murmur spread through the gallery. Several jurors leaned forward. The warehouse had barely been mentioned throughout months of proceedings. Suddenly, it was becoming the center of everything. Rachel displayed the photograph recovered from Harold Pierce's files. The image of the parking lot appeared on the screen. Grainy, imperfect, yet unmistakable. A dark blue sedan sat near the warehouse entrance. Rachel allowed the image to linger. Then she displayed registration records. Then parking logs. Then access reports. Each piece connected to the next like links in a chain. The courtroom felt frozen. Nathan watched Evelyn carefully. For the first time since the trial began, she looked away from the jury. Atlas noticed it too. The German shepherd slowly rose from beside the defense table. No one commanded him. No one touched his leash. He simply stood and watched. His amber eyes never left the prosecution table. Rachel took one final breath. Then she placed a small flash drive on the evidence stand. The defense has additional material recovered from evidence intentionally concealed from investigators. The words landed like thunder in the silence. Across the room, Atlas remained perfectly still, waiting, watching, as though he knew the truth was finally stepping into the light. The courtroom remained silent as Rachel Monroe inserted the flash drive into the evidence system. Even the reporters stopped typing. Snowlight filtered through the tall windows, bathing the room in a pale glow that made every face seem sharper, every expression more exposed. Judge Hartman nodded for her to proceed. The first files appeared on the screen. Shipping records, internal messages, financial summaries. One document led naturally to another until a pattern emerged so clearly that it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Jurors exchanged glances. Several began taking notes more quickly. Rachel moved carefully, allowing each piece of evidence to speak for itself. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. Truth rarely needed help. Then she played the audio recording recovered from Harold Pierce's files. Static filled the room for a moment before his voice emerged. Calm, familiar, certain. Every word seemed to echo against the wooden walls. When the recording ended, nobody spoke. The silence carried more weight than any argument. Across the room, Evelyn Cross remained seated, but the confidence that had defined her throughout the trial was beginning to fade. Rachel displayed another file, then another. Communications connected to the logistics network. Access records tied to Pier 17. Vehicle logs matching dates Harold had documented months before. The chain became impossible to ignore. Nathan sat motionless beside Atlas. For the first time in many months, he was not fighting to prove his innocence. The evidence was doing that for him. Atlas remained standing. His amber eyes watched the room with the same quiet focus that had carried him through every step of the journey. Rachel finally approached the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense rests." Those 4 words settled over the room like snowfall. Judge Hartman reviewed the materials in silence. Minutes passed. They felt much longer. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the courthouse windows. Inside, dozens of people waited. Nathan looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd leaned gently against his leg. The simple gesture carried years of trust, years of loyalty, years of choosing not to leave. The judge removed his glasses and folded them carefully on the bench. His expression was thoughtful, measured, and solemn. He reviewed his notes one final time before speaking. The words that followed changed everything. The evidence presented by the defense raised serious concerns regarding the integrity of the original investigation. The court could not ignore those concerns. The accusations against Nathan Walker could no longer stand as presented. A collective breath seemed to leave the room at once. Nathan closed his eyes briefly, not in celebration, in relief. Deep, overwhelming relief. Reporters immediately began writing. Jurors sat quietly. Some smiled. Others simply nodded. Atlas finally relaxed. His tail tapped once against the floor. Nathan knelt beside him, placing both hands around the dog's neck. For several seconds, neither moved. The room faded away. There was only gratitude, only friendship, only the quiet understanding between two souls who had endured the storm together. And as winter sunlight filled the courtroom, it became clear to everyone present that the path to justice had not begun with a witness, a lawyer, or a judge. It had begun with a loyal dog who refused to forget what others overlooked. 3 weeks later, winter settled gently across Montana. Snow rested on rooftops, pine branches, and quiet country roads like a blanket pulled carefully over the land. The headlines had moved on. The television trucks were gone. The courtroom had returned to ordinary cases and ordinary days. Yet for Nathan Walker, life felt extraordinary simply because it was finally his again. The small cabin he rented outside Billings sat near a frozen creek where cottonwood trees swayed softly in the cold wind. Every morning began the same way. Coffee steaming in a worn ceramic mug, frost glittering across the fields, and Atlas waiting patiently by the front door, ready for another walk. The German shepherd had never understood courtrooms, accusations, or legal arguments. He had only understood one thing. His human needed him. That had been enough. On a bright December morning, Nathan stood on the cabin porch watching sunlight spill across fresh snow. Atlas sat beside him, ears lifted toward the distant call of a raven somewhere in the trees. The world felt quiet again, honest again. Nathan reached down and scratched the thick fur behind the dog's ears. Atlas leaned gently against him. Neither seemed in a hurry to move. Some victories arrived with cheering crowds. Others arrived with silence. A few days later, Rachel Monroe drove out to visit. She brought a box of pastries from a bakery in town and news that several investigations connected to Harold Pierce's records were continuing. More questions were finally being asked. More truths were being uncovered. Harold's work had not disappeared after all. Nathan listened quietly. Then he looked toward a framed photograph resting on the mantel above the fireplace. It showed Harold smiling beside Atlas during one of their old walks near the river. Rachel followed his gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. Some people leave behind monuments. Others leave behind evidence of kindness. Harold had left both. That evening, after Rachel departed, Nathan and Atlas walked along the frozen creek beneath a sky painted gold and blue by the setting sun. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Their footprints stretched behind them across untouched snow. Nathan thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the uncertainty, the months spent wondering if anyone would ever believe him again. Then he looked at the dog walking beside him. Atlas had never doubted. Not once. The realization settled deeply into his heart. Loyalty is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It simply stays. Through storms. Through mistakes. Through long nights when hope feels very far away. The sun disappeared beyond the mountains, leaving the horizon glowing softly in the fading light. Nathan stopped near the creek and knelt beside Atlas. The German shepherd immediately pressed closer. Nathan smiled. A real smile. The kind that comes only after surviving something difficult. For a long moment they remained there together, surrounded by winter, silence, and peace. And if there was a lesson hidden within their story, it was perhaps this. Sometimes truth survives because one person refuses to quit. Sometimes justice arrives because someone chooses courage over fear. And sometimes, when the world stops listening, God sends for pause, a faithful heart, and a friend who never walks away.